If you were to ask me the one thing that separates students who keep improving at the UCAT from those that plateau and stop improving after their first few mocks, it would be whether they reflect on their mocks or not. Reflection is one of the most powerful tools you can use in your UCAT preparation, and that's why I'm going to cover everything you need to know about it in this full reflection guide. I'm going to be covering why you want to reflect, how you want to do it, the loop of reflection that actually leads to the most improvement, different strategies you can use in your reflection, how AI can even help in it, everything you need to know. So stay tuned. So, first, why is reflection actually so important? And the first thing it's going to do is the obvious thing, which is going to help you identify your mistakes. It's going to show you where you're actually going wrong. And then, when you do that process of reflection, which I'm going to get into later, it's going to help you to identify the different things you can change in your technique to stop you from making those errors. So that's the number one thing. You identify your errors, you change your technique, and you stop making those errors. That's pretty self explanatory. The other main benefit of reflection, in my opinion, is helping you to develop your own personal strategy for the different UCAT sections. And I'll give you a little anecdote about my story in decision making and how reflection helped me develop the perfect strategy for myself. So, with decision making, often I found myself running out of time. And at first, this made me decide to skip logic puzzles because logic puzzles are a very long question type. They're only worth 1 mark. So I decided to skip them because that would allow me to have enough time to finish the easier Venn diagram and statistical reasoning questions at the end of the section. And this is something that I do recommend for a lot of students. However, I realized that I was getting actually quite close to being able to finish all of the questions the more and more I practiced. So I decided, what about if I don't skip the logic puzzles and just answer all of the questions in order? And then through doing that in mocks, I actually reflected on it and I looked back on my previous reflections and saw that when I didn't skip the logic puzzles, I was actually able to answer all of the questions in the time because of the sense of urgency it gave me when I had that time pressure running down because I had done the logic puzzles first, right? So that's just one example of where I identified a weakness in my decision making approach. First of all, being I was running out of time, made a change, then, through more and deeper reflection, I realized that I should actually go back to how I was doing it originally. And then, in the real thing, of course, I was able to just answer all of the questions in time. That extra time pressure from skipping the logic puzzles helped me, and I got 880, right? So, it's all about reflecting on the different pacing strategies you do when you skip a question, how you approach a question, the questions you answer, in which order. Everything like that is covered by reflection, and if you're not doing it, you're just going to be walking into the exam kind of blindly hoping for the best, hoping that the way you stumbled across answering the questions is somehow the best, which is unlikely, right? What's the chances that the order you answer the questions in when you first started out is actually the optimal way for you? Not very high, right? So you need to be constantly reflecting and seeing, am I actually approaching this exam in the best way? So the first thing is just identifying the mistakes you're making and changing the techniques that you use to answer the questions so you can get better answering the questions. That's the obvious one. But also, reflection helps you develop the perfect personal strategy for yourself, which is something that no guide is really going to do for you. So, how should you actually reflect to improve your technique on questions? And what I like to do is a kind of loop of reflection. So, essentially, what you do is you look at the questions that you got wrong, you see, why did I get them wrong? What did I do wrong in my technique to cause me to not get the question right? And then you write this down. I'll discuss later why you should always write it down. You write it down, you write down what failed in your technique. And then the most important part is you write, what are you going to change next time? What are you going to try out next time to not make that same mistake again? And there's lots of different ways to get that new technique that you're going to try out. Obviously, you could just think in your brain, what could have gone better? What could I have done differently to get the answer right? Of course, there's the Medify and Med-entry explanations, which will tell you how you could have solved the question, right? But those aren't always the best, in my opinion, because oftentimes, for example, on Medify, for quantitative reasoning, for example, they'll do quite a long winded explanation or one where the number of steps isn't really maximally efficient, if that makes sense. They'll, do a long explanation that anybody could follow, but it's not necessarily the quickest one, right? So you don't want to just use the Medify and MedEntry explanations. You also want to reflect yourself. You want to think deeply yourself on how could I do this question as efficiently as possible. Alternatively, you could also ask AI to help you. You could say, how can I most efficiently answer this question type to minimize the number of calculator steps necessary for quantitative reasoning, for example? And as long as you explain how the UCAT calculator works, it should be able to give you a pretty good technique that you can try out in future. Now, there's no guarantee that this technique that you stumble upon at first is going to be the best. And that's why you need to do a loop of reflection. So you identify the mistake you made, you identify the new technique you're going to try out. And then what you do is you hop into some untimed practice. You try this technique out, see how it feels. If it feels all right, then you switch to timed practice, because remember that how you perform a technique under timed conditions is going to be different to how you perform it when there's no time pressure at all, right? So you need to get that practice in time pressure so it actually becomes a habit when you are under that time constraint, right? So you try it out in untimed. If it feels all right, you go to timed. You do a few question sections on the question type that you're testing the technique on. And then if it's still going all right, you still feel better with it. Then on the next mock, you commit yourself to implementing it. Then of course you repeat the cycle again. Did your technique improve? Did your accuracy improve? Did your timing improve? And if it did, then you write that down again. You write, I tried this technique, it worked. I'm going to implement that for my future mocks and in the real exam. Of course, if it doesn't work, then you repeat again. You go back to the start of the loop. You identify what went wrong. You try a new technique. You maybe rely on the Medify explanation this time, or use AI this time if you didn't previously. And you keep repeating that loop as many times as it takes until you land on the perfect technique for yourself. And this is why it's so important to get as much practice as possible, because only through going through this loop lots and lots and lots of times will you actually land on the perfect technique. So that's how you actually reflect to get better at a given specific technique. But what about the kind of general strategies? Well, for this, it's pretty similar, but of course, you're not going to actually be going through a specific strategy in untimed and timed practice, because the only way you can actually implement the strategy is on a full question section, right? Because if it's a strategy to do with timing, for example, that's only going to be relevant on the actual full, I don't know, 22-minute verbal reasoning section or 26-minute quantitative reasoning section. So instead of doing the whole process where you do untimed and then timed practice, you just say, I'm going to try this new strategy in my next mock and see how it goes. And of course, you need to be writing all of this down for two reasons. First of all, it gives you a record of the changes you've made previously. So if you see that one technique from a couple weeks ago worked better, you can go back to that, try it again, test it again, and see if it still works. So it first of all just gives you a written record, so you actually remember the changes you made. And if you want to go back to an old technique, you can do that. But the other thing is, I think actually just the process of writing stuff down. So I just did it on a laptop. You don't have to actually physically write it down. The process of actually writing it down makes your behavior more likely to change. I believe there are studies on this where essentially if you actually write down a behavior or a change you want to make in your life, or of course in the UCAT, then that's going to make you more likely to actually ingrain that within your habits or within your life, within the way you actually do it, right? You get what I'm saying? Essentially, the actual process of writing stuff down makes it more likely to influence your behavior. And that's what I did. I had just a massive UCAT doc where I wrote down all of my reflections, all the changes in techniques that I wanted to make. And I think it ended up being around 30,000 words. Now, obviously, you don't have to write that much. Most of that was kind of just waffle. But you get my point of writing the stuff down is what's going to actually cause your behavior to change. So write down all of the technique changes you're going to make, all of the strategy techniques you're going to make, and that's how you're going to see the most improvement. I want to quickly say that you don't have to be writing down a technique change for every question you got wrong. Of course, some questions you're just going to make silly mistakes, or it's going to be a technique issue that you were already aware of, or maybe you make the same technique issue in multiple questions on the same section. Of course, in that case, you don't have to write it down for each one. I think instead of writing down a reflection for each question, you should write one down for each learning point, right? Because it's going to take ages if you're writing a paragraph for each question you got wrong. So instead, just go through the questions, decide if there's a learning point that you can take from it, if there's a lesson you can learn from it, and only write down the actual lessons themselves, not the questions you got wrong. There's no point kind of keeping a list of all of the questions you got wrong, because what does that really tell you, right? And you can just access it on Medify or Medentry if you really need to anyway. So, of course, spend a lot of time on reflection. I recommend around a 4-to-1 ratio of practice to reflection, maybe more, but I think that's a good minimum to start off with. So for a 2-hour mock, 30 minutes of reflection. But you also want to be quite efficient with your reflection, right? You don't want to be having to spend tons and tons of time on it. So only write down the actual lessons or the learning points you get, and that should be enough. One thing I do want to say though is that you shouldn't only be taking lessons from questions you got wrong. Actually, sometimes it can be the questions you get right that mess you up the most. For example, if you spend 3 minutes on a single verbal reasoning question or a single logic puzzle on decision making, even if you get that question right, there's still a lesson to be learned there, because you don't want to be spending that long on a single question, right? It's going to mess up your timing for the rest of the section. So don't just look at the questions you get wrong, also look at the questions you got right, the questions you spent a long time on. Was there something you can improve in your technique there to make you more efficient, to make you quicker while still retaining that accuracy? It might not even be that the question looks bad on the surface. For example, it could be a quantitative reasoning question that you answered in 30 seconds, you got it right, but there's still something you can improve there. You know the the phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, I don't think that's true for the UCAT, right? I think something cannot be broke, but it can still be improved upon. So change that quote to, if it ain't broke, it can still probably be improved, because on that quantitative reasoning question where you answer it in 30 seconds and get it right, it might still be that if you use the memory function, you could have got it in 20 seconds instead of 30 seconds. And all of these small improvements are what actually add up in the end. The difference between students who improve a lot with reflection and students who don't improve a lot is the students who improve a lot are going to be looking for every small granular lesson they can get from their mocks. Whereas the ones who don't improve a lot are going to be the ones that just see, oh, I ran out of verbal reasoning here, I'm just going to go quicker on verbal reasoning next time, right? It needs to be detailed, it needs to be in depth, and it needs to have actual actionable changes that you can make for next time, right? Just saying, I'm going to get quicker on these type of questions isn't actually a learning point you can implement, right? Instead, you should be saying something like, I'm going to skip if after 15 seconds I can't identify a keyword. Not that I actually recommend you do that, but more concrete, actual quantitative things are what you need to be looking for and what you need to be testing out. And again, as I said earlier, it's not something that you're committing to forever. It's just something that you're committing to testing out in your next untimed practice, your next time practice, your next mock. And you need to remember that performing good on mocks isn't actually the goal of mocks, right? The goal is just to get the learning points that are going to be useful for the actual exam. So don't worry about always being perfect on mocks. Be willing to try out techniques that may not work, may be a bit more experimental, but have the potential to help you in the actual thing. So don't get too caught up on your mock scores. Don't be afraid to try out new techniques because you think they won't work. Because at the end of the day, if you try out a new technique, it doesn't work, you haven't actually lost anything, right? If anything, you still gain that experience. So my kind of message is to try out everything, try it out, see if it works, and then if it doesn't work, nothing's gone wrong. So I think that's mainly what I want to say about reflection, that essentially you need to have that loop of reflection, seeing what went well. So, what changes from previous mocks actually did work, what didn't work, what are you going to change for next time, And then how are you going to make that actual change? You need to have that concrete plan written down so you actually make the change, not just wish it would happen. And then I think the final thing I'll add is a kind of bonus way to possibly get more out of your reflection if you invest more time. And that's going to be, instead of just looking at the answer straight away, you actually hide the answer. So there's an option on Medify, I think it's on MedEntry as well, to hide the answer before you look at the explanation, of course, and you actually have a go at the question you got wrong and try and work it out and see where you went wrong by yourself. Now, this isn't always going to be the best use of your time because, sometimes you just want to see the answer and see where you went wrong. But I think the actual process of working out what you did wrong, what mistake you made, can help you kind of ingrain that more in your head. Because if you just rush past the mistake you made, don't actually think about it deeply, you're likely to make it again. Whereas if you work out the question from scratch and actually get the right answer through your own effort, then that's going to be a more deeply ingrained behavior that will actually translate onto your next mocks and into the real thing. So if you have more time to invest in your reflection, then hide the answer options, try work out each question again from scratch, and hopefully that should, first of all, make the mistakes more prevalent in your mind in the next mocks, but also teach you the technique that actually does work and help you remember that technique, since when you work something out yourself, you're more likely to remember it and implement it in future. And yes, that's all I want to really say about reflection. I just wanted to kind of give you my philosophy, my thoughts on how best to do it, and hopefully you can implement that in your mocks. The most important part about reflection is you actually just do it, right? If you're not spending that time writing and reflecting, at least 30 minutes for each mock, in my opinion, then you're not going to be getting the benefits. So my advice is to at least write something, but the more concrete, the more actionable, the better.